Hi, hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our Tools for Peace series, Transformative Justice, a tools to transform oppressive system. Thank you for joining us today. We are very excited to welcome you. I am Eve. I'm part of the team at SCI's International Secretariat, and I am one of the moderators today. My colleague Kerry is also here to support the technical parts and the Q&A later on. Before we get started, a few technical announcements. This webinar is being recorded. Your camera and your mic are off, so we can't see you or hear you in the meanwhile. The webinar goes for 90 minutes. Timo and Laura will present for 60 minutes. Then we would have 30 minutes of Q&A. In the meantime, you can send your questions anytime in the Q&A box. It will be answered later during the Q&A part. Chat will be open for you to interact, but if you have questions for the Q&A, please ask in the Q&A box. Now, I'll just take a couple of minutes to introduce you who is behind the organization of this webinar today. So we are the International Secretariat of Service Civil International, a volunteer organization dedicated to promoting a culture of peace by organizing international voluntary projects for people of all ages and backgrounds. SCI is open to all, and it has no political or religious affiliation. We envision a world of peace, social justice, and sustainable development where all people live together with mutual respect and without recourse to any form of violence to solve conflict. Our volunteering projects include work camps, long-term volunteering programs, training courses, and local events. Today's webinar is part of one of our projects, Peace in Diversity, co-founded by Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. Peace in Diversity aims to build the capacity of volunteers, activists, and youth workers on peace and non-violence that will support their work with diverse groups, teams, and communities. The project includes 3 main activities, 2 in-person training courses, one which took place in November in Belgium. Today, we are welcoming you to the 3rd activity of the project, the Tool for Peace webinar series. It is a series of online events aimed at equipping young people with practical skills for practicing peace, conflict transformation, and nonviolent communication in diverse communities. We were motivated to share some of the learning from our project with a wider audience, and that's why we are here today with you. The webinars are meant to be practical, where you would have the opportunity to immediately implement the learning outcomes in your private and professional life. So here today, we meet again with Laura and Timo for the following of their webinar. Today, they will delve into Transformative Justice, a tool to transform oppressive system. And now over to you, Timo and Laura.
Thank you very much, Eve, and also thank you to Kerry and to SCI for having us and for allowing us to share this. And yeah, maybe first of all, I start with with the slides and then continue. You let me know when you can see the screen in sharing mode, in full screen mode.
Yep.
Perfect. Cool. Okay, yes, again, so hi everybody, and welcome to this webinar, Transformative Justice as a Tool for Social Change. And yeah, this is kind of like the second part of a mini-series by Laura and me. The first was on nonviolent communication. And just to give you the outline of today's webinar, we will start with the current justice system, then give you an introduction to what transformative justice is, and then give you like a practical approach or like a practical process of how transformative justice can look like. And then kind of linking it with the webinar from last time and talking about how nonviolent communication, or NVC, and transformative justice can be in alliance with each other. And if you weren't there at the last webinar, that's no problem at all. Like, I think you will take away things nevertheless, and I think it's good. And then the last part, there will be the Q&A session, as Eve just also said. And so what can you expect from today? Well, firstly, to get familiar with critiques of the current system of justice, and then also learning about transformative justice, kind of like the theory behind or its origins, and then also how it can look like in practice. And then lastly, as I said, also in the outline, to reflect a bit on the alliance between nonviolent communication and transformative justice. And so who are we? Well, I am Timo and I use he, him pronouns, and I'm part of Degrowth in Action, which is a small political education collective based in Barcelona. And my activism centers mostly around political education, anti-oppression, but also topics such as nonviolent communication and transformative justice. And Lau?
Yes, hi, I'm Laura. I go either by they pronouns or any pronouns is also fine. I am a Barcelona-based facilitator and organizer and educator. And I work with the collective Degrowth in Action on several topics, such as transformative justice like today, but also degrowth, career liberation, etc.
You?
Yeah, and then before we start, we also wanted to share with you our positionality and a bit of our background. Positionality is basically a practice that was mainly developed by Black feminist scholars. And what it basically does, it brings some awareness to the fact that everybody is in this world looking at things through their own lens. The way that we experience the world, how we are being treated, but also how we understand the world are shaped by our social identities. And so, we just want to give a moment to acknowledge and to share with you that we understand that through our social identities, such as our skin color, our gender, nationality, we have a certain relationship to also today's topic. That means that we might have some shortcomings here and there, but that can also your positionality can also mean a very unique understanding of the world around you. And then we also wanted to share that today on the topic of transformative justice, we're sharing with you our experience with facilitating transformative justice processes. And so, it's based on like a practical basis. And it can look very different for different people. But this is basically our experience. Then following, we also wanted to acknowledge that we're standing on a lot of shoulders of people. So when it comes to the knowledge production and the practices revolving around transformative justice, they go generations back and are mainly developed by Black communities, Indigenous communities. So we just want to highlight that this is basically where transformative justice comes from. And then lastly, we're also adding our own reflections, the connections that we've made between transformative justice and nonviolent communication through our own work, but also recognizing that a lot of things have probably already been talked about or thought about by other people, and so at times we're very aware of quoting other people who work on this topic, but also maybe sometimes not. And so this is a bit of like our positionality and our background before we get into the topic. And then actually one more thing, namely a content warning. As some of you might already know, transformative justice revolves around topics regarding systems of oppression. And so we will be talking about racism, we will be talking about sexualized violence. We won't have like any very specific cases or footage of this all. But we just wanted to let you know that these contents will be talked about. For you to be aware about and to maybe check in with yourself whether you you feel good about being in this webinar and hearing about these topics. If not, then this webinar will also be recorded, and then you can also watch it maybe another time if that suits you better. Then over to Timo.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, so let's dive into the first kind of content part. So we're today here for transformative justice as a tool for peace. And we think that to understand why transformative justice is useful and why it was developed, we first need to understand kind of what is actually wrong with our current system of justice. And if I'm speaking of system of justice, I'm meaning both like formal institutions, so something like prisons and police, but I'm also talking about more like the informal side of things. So our worldviews, our assumptions, our deeply held beliefs around this topic of justice. And we have chosen to use a bit of a wider perspective of critique to kind of like properly really situate this topic of transformative justice in a wider perspective, in a wider framework. So these will be the four kind of critiques that we will talk about. They are there's many more, and we will only be able to kind of have a shallow glance at all of them. So we'll talk about punitive logic, prison complex under neoliberalism, then why the police and state do not keep us safe, and then take a look at how we are currently dealing with justice in our communities. So let's start maybe with something that sits kind of like at the very core of our justice system. And it's a worldview that is very much written into our laws and institutions, but it's also deeply carved into most of our minds and thoughts, and that is punitive logic. So our current system kind of operates on the logic of punishment. So you do something wrong, you get punished. You must get punished. So for example, if you're stealing from a supermarket and you get caught, you need to get punished and maybe put to prison. Or if you are a child and you misbehave during dinner, then maybe you need to be sent to your room as a punishment. And so this is called punitive justice. And there's a whole range of problems with this, but just to mention two kind of things, transformation and healing, that are both aspects that are kind of like left out under this current paradigm or current worldview of punitive logic. So transformation would actually mean that, like, if we would seek transformation, it would mean that we slowly improve our current system and get less and less systemic harm. But instead of kind of like recognizing the root causes of harm, our current system just ignores these root causes of racism, sexism, poverty, exploitation, and in some cases, like rather worsens these causes. And this means that without transformation of the root causes, this harm will be reproduced over and over again. And if we look at healing, which is also not really a part of our current punitive logic, if we punish people, this does not help us heal. So if we're being harmed, then punishing the other person does not help us in our healing process. Then secondly, let's look at the prison complex under neoliberalism. So I'm saying prison complex and not prison because prison complex also entails other punitive institutions such as borders or deportation centers. But yeah, so I'm just going to say the word police, but the word prison, but what I mean is like a wider understanding of this. And prisons are serving a certain purpose under our current neoliberal capitalist system. And if we wanted to get it like in a nutshell, we could probably say that everything is privatized and poverty is criminalized. And I just wanted to give you two examples of how this happens. One is that our current system kind of controls marginalized groups, or like it criminalizes poverty and like to keep marginalized groups at the bottom or at the margins of society. So by criminalizing poverty, for example, through laws against homelessness or laws against minor theft or drug use, the system kind of effectively punishes people for the structural failures of capitalism. So, like for example, so like not existing social safety nets. And just as one example, in Germany, so I'm German, so I will have some examples from Germany. In Germany, people who get caught without paying a metro ticket have to pay a fine of 50 euros. But if you are poor and you can't pay it, then instead you go to prison for such a minor fine as 50 euros. And so this means that in German prisons, there are actually a lot of people who were just unable to pay the metro ticket. And by kind of like punishing poor people for their poverty, the purpose that it serves to our current capitalist system is that it creates kind of like a so-called reserve army for capital. So there's just like it keeps people poor and it keeps people at the margin who are then ready or willing to work at very bad conditions. So it kind of like it creates conditions where people are more easily exploitable. Another similar example is that our current system helps neoliberal capitalism by providing forced labor. So in Germany again, but it's not limited to Germany, there are thousands of prisoners who work for between 1 and 3 euros per hour for big companies, which is like above, around 90% below minimum wage. And they don't have any social protection or benefits that people who work outside of prison, such as like pension funds and so on, that they would have. And then this cheap labor force is used, for example, by car manufacturers like Volkswagen, BMW. So you throw poor people into prisons and then companies exploit them, which is really kind of like peak neoliberalism. And just to wrap this kind of category up, just to say that prison or the prison complex, to a large extent, just serves the interest of private property and big capital, and like kind of to uphold, so to continue the status quo of a system of supremacy. And this is also one of the similarities or overlaps with our militarized defense of borders, which equally serves to protect capital and supremacist imperial interests. Moving to number 3, why the police and the state do not keep us safe. So many of us, especially white people, we're told to go to the police for help and for safety. But for many people, the police does actually not mean safety. And I brought a quote from Mia Mingus, who is a transformative justice and disability justice activist from the US. And Mia Mingus says, state responses to violence reproduce violence and often traumatize those who are exposed to them, especially oppressed communities who are already targeted by the state. And so I think this captures the essence quite well of like why the police and the state do not keep us safe. Because to just like give some maybe more concrete idea, the police is a racist institution, and the police causes harm to non-white people. You could think of racial profiling, for example. You could think of the murder of George Floyd in the US. And of course, there are many George Floyds around the world in many countries. The police is also sexist sexist institution. So for example, survivors of sexualized violence are kind of quite systematically not believed when they go to the police. And often there's a lot of victim blaming, which means that people who suffered harm have to go like through another kind of like layer of this harm being reproduced on them again. And they also often then have no kind of hope for success, because especially if it's happening in more intimate settings where it's then like word against word. So they're like putting themselves out there into a sexist institution kind of without even the like any impact happening or any hope. And these were right now, like how I told it, were like more like kind of choices of not calling the police. But for a lot of people, they also can't call the police. So imagine that you are being illegalized in a country because you don't have the necessary papers. Then calling the police would basically mean that you call the police on yourself, because you put yourself in danger of then getting deported. The same might be true for people that were already convicted before, who might also then put themselves in danger of getting arrested by the police. And so, if they are in need of safety or help, they can't call the police. And then, lastly, I wanted to share a bit how we in our communities actually treat justice, or how we deal with harm in our communities. And if I say in our communities, you can think different kind of ways. So you could think maybe activist group, or maybe you can think in your friend group, or maybe at the workplace. And maybe just like for kind of simplicity, let's say, as an example, we are in a climate justice group, and there's a case of sexualized violence from one member of the group towards another member. And what we then often observe is that there's no real structures that are set in place to deal with this case of sexualized violence within the organization. There's nothing set in place that like kind of like automatically kicks in like certain systematic answer, and like even if there are answers, then often not one that follows transformative justice approach. And so what we then see is often one of two responses. And so this slide kind of like shows the first of these two responses. So because of shame and because of the lack of structures, the incident of harm might just not get addressed. So this might be because of our rape culture in society, in which victims of sexualized violence are actually experiencing a lot of shame from other people, but also because they have internalized this rape culture in themselves. And so they might feel a lot of shame and might then just like not address it. We could also see that in a culture of which would then mean kind of like silence and kind of like nothing happens. But it could also be that in a culture of punitive logic, that the person affected by the harm might not want to address it because they don't want to call out the person who reproduced the harm, just because they might not want to stigmatize them as perpetrator. And the outcome of this is that the person who reproduced the harm is not held accountable for their actions. And it also means that there's no transformation within the organization. So the underlying causes of the harm, they remain in place. For example, let's say sexist norms that allowed the violence to happen in the first place. So you kind of have like a feeling of separation between people. You have no accountability, you have no transformation, and you probably also have little healing for the person affected. Or in another kind of like, let's say, typical response, punitive culture might take the shape rather of like cancel culture and shaming and blaming. And the behavior might then, in such situations, might be called out, and the person who reproduced the harm might get cancelled and might get banned from this group, might get banned from the workplace, thrown out. And then as a response, this person might then just go to another group and again, there's no, like in that case, there's no real accountability in the sense of taking the responsibility for this person to really understand and change their harmful behavior. And also, again, if you look at transformation, the underlying roots, again, they are not addressed. Instead, there was like separation between people, and there was maybe shame, there was guilt, but there was for sure no transformation of what actually caused this harm or let this, like allowed this harm in the first place. And this last slide before I give it over to Lau again. Transformative justice, as you will hear in a second, is kind of like situated within the abolitionist movement. So abolitionism is a movement that wants to abolish, so that means get rid of the police, but also borders and other punitive and oppressive institutions. And the abolition movement is not only a fight against the current system, which you can see on this left side, but at the same time, it also believes that we kind of need to experiment with radical alternatives. And transformative justice is kind of situated in, like, especially on this right side. So kind of transformative justice is a radical alternative or a radical experiment to deal, how we could deal with interpersonal harm. Yeah, and with this, I close kind of like what is wrong with the current system of justice. And Lau will now tell you a bit about then what is actually transformative justice. So what could a radical alternative look like?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I will give an introduction to what transformative justice is. And so imagine a world where harm is not met with punishment, but actually with transformation. And where instead of relying on systems that perpetuate violence, we create communities that foster healing and accountability. This is basically the world that transformative justice envisions. And so to define transformative justice, I'm going to break it down in 4 different pieces. Transformative justice is super broad, so I hope to touch a bit upon everything, but for sure there's also way more to it. It is not just an alternative to like an alternative legal system, but firstly, it's a political framework and an approach to responding to violence and harm and abuse. And a political framework is basically like an understanding or a belief system, like an analysis of the world around us, of politics. And then secondly, transformative justice is also can also be seen as like a way of life, because there are these like very radically different paradigms, so like belief systems behind it. Thirdly, transformative justice is a tool to transform the root causes that Timo talked about already earlier, to transform these root causes of violence. And then lastly, transformative justice can also get a very practical, have practical interventions, such as processes for accountability and healing. And so these are basically like 4 major parts of transformative justice. And now I will go through all of them in a bit more in detail, to start with transformative justice as a political framework. And so, yeah, a political framework is basically a structured way of understanding, organizing, and analyzing political systems, ideologies, and institutions. And so important understandings of transformative justice are that it does not rely on the state. So it does not rely on the police, on prisons, which has been causing harm actually already from the start, and especially to marginalized communities, like Timo mentioned already in the part before. Secondly, another important thing is that transformative justice does not want to reinforce violence through punitive measures like cancel culture, which can replicate the very harm and exclusion that we actually seek to eliminate. And then lastly, transformative justice focuses on healing, accountability, and therefore offering pathways for those who have caused harm to take responsibility and to work towards change, while also centering the needs and the healing of those who have been harmed. So that's transformative justice as a political framework. Then transformative justice as a way of life is grounded in two fundamental beliefs. And so on the left side of the slide, you can see the first belief, which is basically that violence doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that the roots of this violence oftentimes lie in the conditions of the system that we live in. And so I put here an illustration of like different systems of oppression. So sexism, racism, classism, they are all factors that create conditions that actually make harm more likely to occur. So this is like an important understanding of transformative justice. And then on the right side, we can see another important understanding, which is namely that everyone is capable of reproducing harm. And so transformative justice moves beyond this like simplistic idea of that there's good people and then there's bad people, but instead it acknowledges that harm is something that we are all capable of, and that we have also probably all been harmed at some point. And so this is what you can see on this illustration, is that like on the left side, you have this circle of having caused harm, and on the right side, having been harmed, and it has an overlap. And basically in this overlap, that's where we can find all of us. So those are two very like grounding, rooted understandings of transformative justice. Then to the third, namely transformative justice as a tool to transform root causes of violence, I also brought a quote by Mia Mingus that Timo mentioned earlier. And it goes, "How can we respond to violence in ways that not only address the current incident of violence, but also help to transform the conditions that allowed for it to happen?" And so transformative justice is a way for us to unlearn the punitive logic that is ingrained in many of us, and instead it offers us a different paradigm. And so through creating different conditions, it's going to be less likely to have harm to be occurred, for harm to occur. And then through justice, also healing is possible. And so it's not just for individuals, but for entire communities, which means that we can collectively shift away from cycles of harm towards collective liberation. And then lastly, transformative justice are also processes for accountability and for healing. And these processes are basically like interventions that are part of the broader like transformative justice framework. And after I finish with this part, with this introduction, Timo will talk in more detail of how these processes look like and what comes with it. Yeah, and so again, these 4 cornerstones of transformative justice. You can go to the next slide, Timo. It's a political framework, a way of life, a tool to transform these root causes, but also processes for accountability and healing. And so transformative justice asks us to imagine new possibilities for responding to harm. Ones that instead of reproducing harm, it creates deeper connection, accountability, and healing. And this is not always easy. But it is for sure necessary if we want to build a world that is rooted in true justice and in care. And so with this, I'm closing this introduction on transformative justice, and I will give it back to Timo to show you how a transformative justice process can look like.
Thank you very much. Yes, let's go to part 3. So how does transformative justice look like in practice, or at least how can it look like in practice? on the next slides, I will show you a bit like kind of like an example or like an exemplified and simplified version of a process of community accountability of transformative justice in response to sexualized violence in the community. And I took this example largely from a climate justice organization called Ende. They are operating mostly in Germany, and also a bit based on the own experiences of Laura and me, who have been involved like in a couple of transformative justice processes. We sometimes say like transformative justice process, sometimes we say accountability process. It's not always so clear, and I think for now this also doesn't matter so much. But yeah, just to say that the process that I am going to show you is just like one way how it can look like. And there are a lot of different ways that a process could be shaped, topics that could be talked about in response to experiences of harm. I'm going to split it into kind of three phases. First, like the immediate response to sexualized violence, then the long-term response, and then kind of like the phase 3 accountability, repair, and healing. Let's start with phase 1, the immediate response. So in this kind of like example, there's an incident of one person reproducing the harm and one person being the affected person. So these are sometimes a bit unusual or like surprising terms for the people, but they are like we're using these terms, so like a person reproducing the harm instead of the word perpetrator. And we're using the word affected person instead of the word victim, just to not reproduce this logic of good and bad that we would otherwise do, and also to not essentialize people in the sense of what defines them is this incident where a person reproduced harm or this incident of where a person was affected by harm. And so this is why we're using this wording. So let's say in this group, there's a case of harm, of like an experience of harm. And then this affected person would contact a response group. In this organization that I mentioned, Endoglender, there's kind of like a existing structure that people affected by harm can reach out to. But maybe in your own settings, there is no such structure. So this response group could also just be maybe friends or like the closest people or like maybe a facilitator, just like depending on your context. But this is just like the point of entry, like where the person affected by the harm lets other people know. And then this response group kind of creates or helps create three different groups: a facilitation group, a contact group, and a support group. And in this case, just like to have it a bit more clear, I just wrote like 2 people each so that just you have like an idea how it could look like. But this, again, can also vary a bit. But in the context where both Laura and I have been present, this has often been 2 people. Yeah, maybe to start with about the facilitation group, I will say a bit at a later stage. But the contact group, what is its role? So they are established to kind of like contact the person who reproduced the harm and also confront them or call them in for the experience of harm or by the like about the harm that this other person experienced. Yeah, so to let them know that they have been contacted. And then also they might communicate protective measures, and the protective measure is just so that the person affected by the harm feels safe. So if these 2 people are operating in a shared space normally, then maybe as an immediate response, one protective measure might be that that the person who reproduced the harm needs to not be in the same space for a while. And very important is that this can sound like a punitive measure and like a punishment, or like this person did something and now they're being punished by being sent away. But while the output may be the same, is that the motivation for it is safety and protection. And this is just like a different approach, or like a different way of looking at it. It's not to punish this person. The contact group would then also communicate with the support group, and the support group is kind of created to support the affected person. So to check in with their needs, how are they doing? Maybe they need emotional care, maybe they need somebody to talk to just see what they actually need in this moment, and to just be there for them. Let me see. Yes, and so maybe one last point about this is that this approach kind of centers the experience of the affected person. So this person, which is like in a strong contrast as to our normal punitive logic and normal formal system of justice, where survivors of violence are often then not believed. It kind of like, as a first step, it says that the person affected by the harm can define their experience of harm. That does not mean that they have then the power to decide what happens to the other person, but at least as a first step, their experience is centered, and they are, as a starting point, they are believed. Then we go over into kind of phase 2. So let's say the long-term response. And for this is now where the facilitation group that was also created in the first step plays a central role. And the facilitation group, together with the person who reproduced the harm, does accountability sessions. And these accountability sessions, they're kind of like a structure or like a vehicle in which people try to actually transform, or to understand what caused the harm and what caused the violence, and to transform these root causes. This would mean maybe that the facilitation group, together with the person who reproduced the harm, they might do, let's say, 10 sessions of each 2 hours. And in each session, they talk about a different topic. So I've written down some of the topics. Maybe in the first session, you need to establish some trust between the people. And then maybe in the second session, you talk about patriarchal masculinity. What is it? How was that? How did the person reproducing the harm maybe experience patriarchal masculinity while growing up? Maybe the session 3 is about power and privilege. You could talk about consent and boundaries. You could talk about empathy with the other person's experience. So there's a lot of different session topics. And there's also a resource called the New York Curriculum of Accountability. And I think, in my understanding, the slides of this will be shared with you afterwards. Maybe Carrie and Eve can correct me later if I'm wrong. And in there, we have kind of like a resource session where we have also linked this one. And they, in this curriculum, they have a lot of material. So they have a lot of suggestions for topics that people could talk about. They also have a lot of suggestions for reflection questions that you could go through together. But there might also be homework. So, for example, in the processes that I've been part of, as a facilitator, we have sent homework to the person reproducing the harm. So, for example, sending a certain text beforehand and asking this person to read the text, and maybe also answer 3 or 4 reflection questions beforehand. And then in the session, we could then go through this homework together and use it as a starting point for discussion for this topic. And then, of course, there are still also support groups. And in this case, I wanted to show you both support groups on both sides. So from right to left, there's also support group, or there could be a support group for the person who reproduced the harm. So this support group has a bit this function of supporting this person in the process, which might mean to listen to them, to maybe hold space for their emotions also, but it could also look like also helping them to be accountable. So to also call them in if they're still like, if this person might maybe say things that are reproducing certain violent worldviews. So they're kind of like their support group. And on the left side, we of course still have the same support group that we also saw in the last slide. And they still have kind of like the same task. And they might also be in touch with the facilitation group and be kind of like updating the person affected by the harm about maybe the progress of the accountability sessions, what has been talked about. And then lastly, so this might go on for a while. So like there's processes that are that don't have like a number of sessions predefined at the beginning, and maybe there will only be 5 sessions, but there's also processes with maybe 30 sessions or even more. And in the end, of course, it's about accountability, repair, and healing. And how healing and repair happens, this can only be seen like as a case at a case-to-case basis, basically. But I just wanted to write down some of the things that might be happening towards the end of such a process and to kind of like move forward. But very important to say that this can only happen kind of like based on the needs of the affected person. But yeah, some things that could help with repair and healing and accountability is one, a changed behavior. So like if the person reproducing the harm is actually changing their behavior in all of their lives. There might be apology letters. There might be a reconciliation meeting between the two people involved that might be facilitated by a mediator, where they actually talk to each other and however that can look like. There might also be kind of like reparations paid from the person reproducing the harm to the affected person. This could look like, for example, paying a number of therapy sessions. Or in a case that a friend of mine was part of, the reparations looked like every month sending kind of like the summary of certain literature on the topic of consent and other topics, like reading these articles and then sending kind of like a summary for a while to the affected person. All of this is just to say this has to be seen by the team, but these are just like some of the approaches that could lead to some repair, some healing. Yeah. So this is just one way of how it could look like. And now over to Lau, and to kind of like link it now with our last webinar and nonviolent communication.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so exactly. In our last webinar, we introduced nonviolent communication. Well, for the people who were there, you will get maybe to refresh your brains, and for the people who weren't there, we'll give a little recap so you know what it's about. And we will introduce it by showing an iceberg. This iceberg is a way to visualize a theory of nonviolent communication. And so what this iceberg is basically showing is that there is this tip of the iceberg that is above the water. And what we see there are visible behaviors. And so behaviors such as complaining, laughing, interrupting, like those are all human behaviors that we can see and that we can observe. And then what NVC, so what nonviolent communication says, is that at the water level, and so sometimes visible, but also sometimes not, that's where our feelings are. Feelings such as curious, angry, sad, or anxious. So they're sometimes visible, but sometimes also not. So that's why it's at this water line. And then below the water, that's where we find our needs, so our human needs. There's basically, nonviolent communication says that there is more or less a basic set of human needs that we all have and that we're all trying to meet. And yeah, just a few listed here are shelter, autonomy, connection, purpose. And so yeah, so again, like what this shows is like you have these visible human behaviors. They are driven by our feelings, and then in turn, our feelings are driven by our needs. And so this is an important base understanding behind nonviolent communication. And what it does is it tries to like basically nonviolent communication is a communication approach or a tool to foster understanding and connection based on understanding each other's feelings and needs. And so there are like several steps to express yourself in a nonviolent manner, which is through first observing. So like, what do you see happening? Then secondly, how does it make you feel? Then thirdly, what are your needs behind it? So it's basically these like three behaviors, feelings, needs. And then lastly, making a request. And with all of this, what is very important is that there is as little as or like no judgment. And so when you observe something, that you try to do that more or less neutral and not so much like with the judging attitudes. So we explored that in the last webinar, how nonviolent communication is important on like different levels, on individual level, but also in group settings, again, in like activist groups, but also on a broader societal level. It's useful as a conflict resolution tool and to just foster more understanding and connection. And we think in our experience with like both nonviolent communication and then also with transformative justice, that together they are a great match and an even stronger tool for social change, so to say. And then we can go to the next slide. Because we do think though that like both of these frameworks have some shortcomings, but that are very well complemented by the other. And so at the top of the screen in the blue, you can see elements of nonviolent communication. And so, for example, nonviolent communication is a non-punitive language. So it gives us a vocabulary to use during transformative justice processes. It gives you a language to make sure that you don't use punitive language, that you don't reproduce this while you're actually trying to do the opposite. You're trying to be non-punitive, but you need the words for it. And so in that sense, we found that it's very helpful to have nonviolent communication as a vocabulary. Like we've literally like used overviews of like certain feelings and needs that people can have. And during these transformative justice processes, they were basically like a helping hand to understand the other person and to empathize with each other. And then next to that, nonviolent communication also makes it able for us to ask very important questions that are needed in these transformative justice processes. For example, what needs were you trying to meet while causing harm? What emotions were behind that action? And how can we acknowledge all of these needs while still holding people accountable for their actions? And so, then all the way on the right, we can also see that nonviolent communication provides a needs-based and, like, so to say, case-by-case perspective, which is very important because that basically makes it able to see that you cannot treat everyone the same. And so where transformative justice, what we can see on the right bottom of this screen, it provides us a political lens through which we can look at systemic violence that tends to sort of like homogenize people. And so this needs-based case-by-case perspective makes it that is sort of like put in balance. But then to come back again to this political lens that transformative justice has is like this is basically like what transformative justice, like with this arrow back, brings to nonviolent communication. Because without this political lens, nonviolent communication can be quite apolitical and actually not see like violence in a more systemic matter. And without it, it's then also difficult to see patterns more broadly. And so this is where we think that nonviolent communication and transformative justice are super complementary, because you have both a tool to look at things case by case, but also to see patterns in a more like broader systemic manner. And so then to go up again to the blue, nonviolent communication is a super great tool for conflict resolution, but transformative justice actually takes it a step further. And so, because like conflict resolution alone does not change the conditions that allowed the harm to happen in the first place. And so transformative justice pushes us to ask, how can we transform ourselves or our relationships or our communities so that this harm does not happen again? Because what happens often with merely conflict resolution is that you basically see that the situation is being restored to the status quo. And so it's being restored to a place where the harm was apparently able to happen. And so this is where transformative justice is like, hey, no, this is not what we're going to do. We're going to take this a step further, and we're going to actually try to make sure that these conditions change so this cannot happen again. And so through this like extra step of like going beyond conflict resolution, transformative justice provides a pathway for justice and for accountability that seek this like long-term change and not just immediate resolution. What tends to happen with merely conflict resolution without a broader political lens. And so finally, this combination of justice and accountability, we've seen that also makes healing then in the end possible. And yeah, so this is where we have seen in our work that these two frameworks, nonviolent communication and transformative justice, complement each other in a super good way, and not just having like some shortcomings where like the other then fills in the gap. We also have seen that nonviolent communication and transformative justice have super similar roots, and that we can see in the next slide. Yeah, so we see that the roots of nonviolent communication of transformative justice are very similar, namely centering care for everyone. So seeing like also like caring for the person who is affected by the harm, but also caring for the person who has reproduced the harm. So like earlier in the part where Timo explained about a transformative justice process, you saw that there were like there's a possibility to have two support groups. And so this care for everyone, that's also something that we see in nonviolent communication to try and understand like everyone involved and what their emotions and their needs are. And then secondly, which is very much aligned to it, both these frameworks also try to seek humanity in everyone and seeks connection by not having this black and white vision of there's good and bad people, but by seeing the nuances, by seeing how how violence is something that could be reproduced by all of us. And so together, these two, nonviolent communication and transformative justice, they offer us a way forward, a way to break cycles of harm without punishment, so without reproducing more violence, to seek justice without having to exclude people, and to actually create a world where accountability and care can go hand in hand. And these two frameworks together, they also remind us that like transformation and healing are not only necessary, but they are also just possible. Like they have been used already for generations. And it also shows us that this true justice that I think a lot of us want just does not come through punishment. But it can come through empathizing with each other and transforming what is necessary to stop violence from happening. Yeah, that's our presentation. Yeah, putting nonviolent communication and transformative justice hand in hand. And then now we have space for all of your questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, both of you. That was great. Very clear. I think that was a really nice note to end on as well, that this work has been going on for centuries, and maybe sometimes it feels like a radical idea or a radical step, but this is how communities have actually functioned for a very long time. So yeah, thanks for highlighting that. We've received a lot of interesting questions in the Q&A. There have also been a lot of comments, a lot of people sharing where they're watching from today, which is lovely. And yeah, I'm thinking we've got half an hour. I think we can get through quite a few of the questions, so I'm gonna pick a few. One comment from the chat that I just wanted to share from you from earlier. Someone said they were very glad to see speciesism mentioned when discussing transformative justice. So someone appreciated that. Okay, so maybe to go into a question. One question from Justine. Could you explain more deeply why you use the terms reproducing violence and not committing violence?
Yeah. Shall I go?
Sure.
Yeah, these terms, like saying like reproducing violence or like reproducing harm instead of like committing harm, basically highlights this idea that harm is often part of a cycle of trauma. And so people who have caused harm may themselves also have experienced harm. And that these systems of oppression that we showed earlier in the presentation, that they can be basically like starting points of harm across like generations. And so in that sense, saying reproducing harm instead of committing harm is like a way to highlight this. Yeah. I don't know, Timo, if you want to add something to this.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah, clear. Another question from Wilbert. How do you communicate protective measures in a closed community when there's limited space for separation between the affected person and the person reproducing the harm?
I go this time?
Sure.
Yes. Thanks for this question. I think it's important to highlight that we do not have the answers like for all of like these so every transformative justice process is very individual, and there's not like this one blueprint that you can just like use. Like there are certain structures, and like the ones that we have shown today, like just like serves to maybe give you an idea of how it could look like, but it's very difficult to now just say like how to implement it. But yeah, just to say that the needs of the affected person should always be still at the center, and like in a closed context, this might then also still mean to exclude a person from a space for a certain amount of time. I don't know if you're talking about like your workplace, or if this is like a different group, but yeah, so this, like if there's no possibility to kind of like just like avoid each other, like if I understand this question correctly, yeah, then there might be the need to yeah, to exclude the person reproducing the harm for how long is needed. Like of course the idea is always like to just exclude them maybe as long as is necessary, but yeah, like the center of this is the needs of the affected person. And they might also, like there should never be pressure on the person affected by the harm, like you have to heal more quickly now or something. Like they heal at their own space, at their own pace, and yeah, this should be taken into account.
Yeah, and maybe just like a short thing about like then, because I also understood the question of like how to communicate this. That there, I think, yeah, like again, what Timo said, like things are very case by case, and it very much depends on the relationships and the dynamics. But I think that in general, I would opt for just like clear and caring communication, and like communicating something like this with a person who has been well, at least like accused of like reproducing harm. Yeah, that can indeed also just be very shocking for this person. And so try and make sure that this happens in a kind of like safe environment also for them, where like shaming doesn't happen. So like some kind of like private setting, so to say. And yeah, I've also just found it important to keep highlighting and letting this person know that this is not a punishment, but just like a safety measure. And then you can indeed also see if maybe this person just needs a support group, like if this exclusion also has like if this safety measure, like exclusion as safety measure, has like big consequences on their life, to then also carry this a bit more like as a collective responsibility of the community. And indeed, like it's I don't know, like about like what context it is, but to yeah, try and seek like suitable solutions for the case.
And even, sorry, I'm going to add one more thing even now, just like from also our own context, like as an experience, that there are sometimes like you need to find a balance in between, that it can be useful to just be very transparent within the entire group, like to kind of also avoid stigmatization, like to kind of like talk with people also about what approach are you actually taking, like you're trying to deconstruct in a whole community, you're trying to deconstruct this punitive logic, and like, okay, this person is being sent away, how can everybody in this community try to work against their own thoughts of stigma. But that can, of course, also be in contrast or like be in opposition to what the affected person is wishing for, and maybe wishing for anonymity.
Thank you both. I think that's, yeah, useful. There's a question here. Can transformative systems include social media, like people who get attention to crimes via social media? And I'm not sure how you two understand that question, or if the person would like to expand in the chat, but I'm thinking it might be something around cancel culture and people being called out on social media, and whether transformative justice could be applied in this kind of context?
I have some thoughts. Shall I go? Okay. Well, I have two kind of like thoughts on this. One, what we have shared, or this, especially this practical kind of like process, is very much a community process. And so like it being like a global social media thing and like people that don't know each other, like having some way of community accountability, that is for sure like I think a difficult thing to do. But for me, transformative justice also means a certain approach, like a certain approach, like to how you approach things and how you think about things. And so, if you call out a certain behavior, to then just also still remember that this person is has probably been socialized into oppressive systems, into violent systems, and to yeah, not go into this cancel culture, like to like I find it very understandable why people go there, but yeah, to try to counteract this and to, if you can, if you have the capacities to not go into this cancel culture and see the humanity also of the like of the oppressor of or of this person reproducing the harm.
Yeah, I hope that answered the question that this person intended to ask. That's how I understood it anyway. Great. So there's one question that was also a question I had in mind while you were talking, and that is, how is the TJ process different than a typical mediation process? And what role does the willingness of the person that reproduced the violence play in the process? And I was thinking particularly about this this second part as well. How much buy-in is needed from everybody involved, and can it work even if, you know, there are different views and approaches within the group of people involved?
Yeah, maybe I can start now. Yeah, so regarding the difference between like a sort of like typical mediation process and a transformative justice process, I would say to simplify it a bit is that like with transformative justice, there has for sure been like there has been an experience of harm. And so it needs a yeah, like a process that addresses this harm, that we can learn from, and that then there can, yeah, like amends can be made, etc. Whereas like with mediation, you can also have a more or less like you can have like a disagreement or like a conflict without it being very clearly where or like if there was harm. And so it can just be also about a like a mismatch of needs between people, or a mismatch between like strategies to meet those needs. And so there I would say like what is different is that like, yeah, mediation does not I think I would say like does not actually involve like a harmful act, whereas like with transformative justice that would be the case. And then regarding willingness, yeah, like I think this is a super good point. I think yeah, you need massive willingness of people involved, and there's some background noises. I don't know if you can hear it. All good. Yeah, like I think willingness is indeed like super important, and I think it's also like it also makes you reflect on that like no tool, so like such as transformative justice, can be like a silver bullet, and that there's also just an like there is a limit to what you can do as individuals or like as a group, And if a person is just really unwilling to participate, yeah, like these things can happen, and that is then like not always in your control. Yeah, so yeah, I would say that for sure, like willingness is needed, and you can, you know, like try as best as you can to make the conditions happen, so you can like opt for a transformative justice process. But yeah, it's sadly not a given. Like it's a big task. Yeah. Do you have anything to add on this, Timo?
Maybe just on the first question, that I also think that the role of the community is maybe slightly different. So like a mediation process could just also be like somebody external coming in, whereas in transformative justice, at least the basic idea is how Laura had described in their part, like that we have a collective responsibility to work on this harm.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this your explanation there hopefully answers a couple of other people's questions. Someone had asked about where was that now? Yeah, how to ensure that community continually subscribe to the values of TJ and don't begin falling out, because the processes can be quite long. So I think hopefully you got a bit of context from your answer now. Quite an interesting question from Julia in the chat. How do these experiments relate to traditional institutionalized ways of justice, in the sense of what is the legal framework to create for such alternatives? Like maybe how does transformative justice, obviously it criticizes the institutional framework. Is there is there anything you can imagine to create harmony between these systems? I guess based on an abolitionist perspective, probably not, but maybe there's something interesting to say there.
It's a very interesting question, but also a very difficult one. And yeah, like Carrie, as you said, like I would also turn to kind of like abolitionism here as a response. Maybe also a good time to say again that as we said, like in the beginning, like we have like some experiences with this and so on, but we are far from having all the knowledge on this. And so just also to invite your, like, if this is a topic that you find interesting or questions that are in your mind that we can't answer, to seek answers elsewhere or like from other people or something. Yeah, I'm kind of thinking like abolitionist framework like kind of says that it's not that the current system is not working, it is that it is exactly working how it was designed, or like how, like what it was intended for. And so you can't kind of like correct or reform a system that is working. You know? And so the system kind of needs to be abolished, so like needs to be kind of like burned down. And then it's interesting to think like what would the legal framework need to look like if we were to have a transformative justice set up in mind. Well, then my thoughts go rather into kind of like anarchist way of organizing society, where we center care and not so much hierarchy and dominance. But yeah, maybe that's like I would go down that path, that would become like a very long answer. So maybe I keep it here.
Yeah, maybe another webinar would be needed to to go further into this. Okay, great. one question here. We still have quite a lot of questions. I'm not sure whether we're going to get through everything. But maybe I can actually say here, since some of the questions were about recordings, we will share the recording of both this webinar and Timo and Laura's first webinar again in the follow-up email, and probably some extra resources as well that might be useful. So yeah, if anyone was wondering about that, you will get the recording, so don't worry. One question from Giacomo. How can be seen in this way the examples around the world of truth and reconciliation commissions? I don't know if I have a repeat the question. The question is, how can truth and reconciliation commissions be seen through this framework? I think maybe, I don't know if it's clear, or maybe we can ask Giacomo to rephrase the question a bit in the chat. Yeah.
I'm afraid that I'm maybe not familiar with what Giacomo is referring to.
Yeah.
I have to say that something interesting that now pops up though with like hearing the word truth is that I think what I found interesting in my process of like learning more about transformative justice is that I think a lot of us were raised with a massive like highlights on like finding the truth, and that there is like one truth of like how a situation has happened. And so within this like punitive logic, and like that's also like what our legal system does right now, is that yeah, we're trying to seek truth, and then based on that there is like punishment. But like yeah, with the few processes that I've been involved in so far, I've already seen like all the time that there are just very different experiences of the same situation. And so like truth seeking is not so much like a central part of transformative justice, I would say, but that it's more about acknowledging people's experiences, and then trying to see what people need. And so I also have never saw myself as some sort of like detective, like trying to figure out like what actually happened on like precisely what moments. Like for sure, like it's important to know, of course, yeah, more or less like what happened. But yeah, maybe that's still like an interesting thing, so Giacomo can have a little bit of an answer.
Yeah, I also don't have a good understanding of what these commissions are. Like, if I remember, like, if I'm understanding it correctly, it might refer to kind of like these commissions like you had after violent conflict, like in Colombia or also South Africa. And then I think there's a lot of overlap, but I don't have enough knowledge on it to give you a good answer. But I think it's a super interesting question, and also to think how much overlap probably in worldviews there already is between maybe these commissions and transformative justice. Just that they are also on different scales, maybe. But yeah, I don't know enough.
Thank you both. Yeah, and I think that little reflection on the concept of truth actually was quite interesting. Added something to thinking about the process. There was one more question here. I'm not doing very well at ticking them once we've answered them, but we're managing.
Can I say something in between, Carrie? Otherwise,
yeah, of course you can. Yeah.
This will be like a 1-minute advertisement, kind of, just to say that our organization, Degrowth in Action, has like 2 kind of like trainings coming up that are a bit on similar topics as the 2 topics that we will cover today. So like we will have one training, like a youth exchange coming up on utopia and kind of like imagining utopian societies, which transformative justice could be a part of. And we have a training on how nonviolent communication can serve as a strong tool in a polarized world. And for one more week, we are open for partners. Probably our emails will be shared in the documents that you sent around, Carrie, right? But also maybe Laura, you could share in the chat our email address. And so if you're an organization and you want to be part of one of these 2 speaks to you, or you just want the call for partners to be sent to you, you can send us an email. Yeah, okay. Advertisement block closed. Thank you.
Great. And another way to learn more and stay engaged. And yeah, we can also put this in the follow-up email. So yeah, just send the information over and we can make sure it's shared with everybody. I'm thinking we go for one more question. I was saving this one. I think it's quite nice to end on. And then I will just say a few things to wrap up and about the future webinars, and then we can finish. So this is a question from Uslem, who is graduating from law school. The only thing students are taught in schools is how to punish people. It seems as if the entire world is built on punishment. Having your ideas taught as lessons in universities would make a great contribution to humanity. So how can we explain the things you have mentioned to societies? Might be interesting to talk a bit about your methods. Yeah, the ways that you reach people and do education in your work.
You want to go or I go first? I go. Yeah, I think that in our collective we heavily believe like in the power of political education, and like I so much agree with you that like I'm super frustrated if I think about our current education system in like basically almost around like everywhere that I know of, and what we're being taught and like what would be needed to be in like caring societies, like interconnected societies. I don't know if I have like a very specific answer to you, other than that I think it needs a lot of multipliers to just like spread frameworks like transformative justice, both with its kind of like radical analysis of a racist imperialist system, and with the radical experiments and like imagining the world. So I don't know what your context is. Maybe like if you're in this call, probably you are maybe already engaged somewhere, but yeah, that I think we just need to come up with a lot of different formats for different people. In our work, we try, I mean, this is a bit difficult today, like in a webinar like this, but we try to normally in our work, try to kind of like speak not only to the head, but also to the body, to the heart, and like do also theater exercises, like to combine kind of like frameworks, like theoretical frameworks with practical applications, with embodied exercises and so on. Yeah, maybe broadly kind of following the approach of Paulo Freire from like pedagogy of the oppressed in our broader pedagogical approach. And maybe this answer was like very much too vague, but yeah, I don't know, Lau, maybe you have got something to add.
Yeah, I was thinking that because the question is also about like how to communicate this and sort of like how to spread this message in a world that is indeed like so punitive, that I actually think that like trying to master like nonviolent communication is also actually very helpful with this. because oftentimes talking about these alternatives, you're being met with maybe some like fears or doubts, and actually being able to empathize with people that like, yeah, transformative justice just like maybe seems like so far away from our current norm, that actually helps make this connection with people, and that you don't lose them while you're trying to actually like yeah, make this message come across. Like I saw a chat also earlier, like something in the chat earlier of someone being afraid that like, yeah, transformative justice like might be exploited without like stronger punishment. Like, yeah, like these fears are like super common and like super understandable. And then so, yeah, like letting that sit also there, I think is actually very important when we yeah, when we try to spread these radical alternatives. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much, Timo and Laura, and thank you everybody who joined. Thanks for the brilliant questions. Yeah, you will be getting an email from us, I think tomorrow. And yeah, our next webinar, unfortunately not with Timo and Laura, that was the second of the two with you two. It will be on March the 27th, and yeah, we'll start promoting it in the next month or so. You can follow us, Service Civil International SCI. We are on the Facebook, Instagram, and so on. And yes, next webinar on March 27th. So I hope to see some of you again. And have a great evening,
Thank
morning,
you.
day.
Can I maybe say one thing more?
Yes,
First, everyone also in the chat for all your lovely messages. And I also read quite some messages of people mentioning Palestine and how that's affecting them. So I just want to say that I hear you, I see you, and I feel you in this pain and like what it does on our day-to-day lives. Also for the people who I saw are actually tuning in from Palestine. Yeah, let's try to foster this solidarity and yeah, stay connected. So thank you.
definitely. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Ciao. Thank you.
Bye.